Or have you been paying attention? Have you been listening? Has anyone ever asked these questions before? I have. Recently, my wife asked me, have you been listening? And I thought, it's a very strange place to start a conversation. And then I thought about it more, and it's actually the perfect place to start a conversation about listening. Because as it happens, we're actually getting worse at listening. As a society, as a whole, collectively, our attention span is narrowing. Partly, that's because of information overload. There's simply too much information being thrown at you all at the same time for you to take it all in. And so when I realized how much of a big problem this is, I've put together a series of graphs and charts and statistics for you that will go over the next half an hour to showcase just how much information is really being thrown at us on a daily basis. But we're going to start with listening skills, because our listening skills are endangered and they're at risk of extinction, and we need your help. There are different levels of listening. I'll just let you read that cartoon. And there's differences between hearing and listening. I don't know if you knew that, but hearing is the physical aspect of sound traveling into your ears and making its way to your brain, whereas listening is actually the cognitive effect that noise has on your mental ability to take in that information and to use it, to apply it. As it turns out, there are people out there who can't hear, who are hard of hearing, who are deaf perhaps, and they can actually be very good listeners. Because a deaf person or a hard of hearing person, when they're involved in a conversation, they have to lock on. They have to be like a missile lock. They have to pay all of their attention to that person. They need to watch the lips. They need to watch the social cues. They need to watch the body language. They need to interpret all of those things to be able to understand and process what is going on. So being good at hearing actually has no bearing on how good you are at listening, because most of us here have pretty much perfect hearing, and yet there's actually a lot of people in the world who are bad listeners. In fact, most of us are bad listeners. And there are levels of listening. Essentially, there are 5 different levels. This is true, and you can research them yourself. Most people either pretend to listen, selectively listen, which is listening for information that is relevant or interesting to them. They defensively listen, looking for an opportunity to jump in when it's their turn or when it's not their turn. And then those final 2, attentively and empathetically listening. And that's what we call active listening skills, trying to take on as much as you can from the conversation that you're having. And that final level there of empathetic listening, that's the only level in which the listener leaves their own frame of reference and steps into someone else's place and tries to understand them from their perspective. And it's the highest form of mastery when it comes to listening, but it's the one that's practiced the least. Jesus described his generation as those who are unwilling to see, unwilling to hear, and unwilling to understand him and be converted. What might he think about today's generation? Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Now, this happens all the time, everywhere, to just about everyone. This probably happened to you today. Someone might have asked you a question simply so that they could talk about themselves. But I suppose we're not here to think about other people's actions. At the end of the day, we only really have the opportunity to influence the actions of one person, and that's your spouse. No, yourself. So have a think about when's the last time that you did that to someone else, that you asked them a question simply so that you could have your input. What does the Bible say? He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is a folly to him and a shame, or a folly and a shame to him. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, both from the Proverbs there, and it shows there's a clear line of separation between preconception and careful consideration. You may think, I already know what this person's going to say, and jump in. It's like the judge passing sentence before they've heard the evidence. But the careful consideration, we'll find it's actually what Jesus showed us through his ministry, is that the heart of the righteous listens carefully. It studies. It makes an attempt to understand someone before passing judgment, before giving an answer. And I know that we said we'd bypass the statistics and the graphs and things for tonight, but I do have one cherry pie graph to show you. And it's the difference between the times in which Jesus interrupted and Jesus answered. You just simply don't read about it. And Jesus interrupted them. And Jesus butted in. Jesus, having thought of something really funny to say, cut them off. Jesus, knowing more than them all, decided to save their own time. We just simply don't read about it, but over 80 times we read about Jesus answered. Now, I don't know what that says to you, but to me, if you sit and think about it, to answer somebody as Jesus did, it means that he heard them, he was listening to them, he understood them, he tried to see their frame of reference as to why they were saying those things, he studied to answer, he spoke with righteousness, and he cut to the heart of the matter, as Jesus always did. After 3 days, they found Jesus in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. This is just a story of a young man here, Jesus Christ, but what an example of humility. The Word made flesh, the one person who didn't need an instructor, who didn't need a teacher, who didn't need a pastor, who didn't need anybody to show him the way and direct him how to read the Bible, and yet here he is, sitting with the doctors, those who have studied the law, and both hearing them and asking them qualifying questions, trying to understand their frame of reference. As usual, Jesus Christ shows us the perfect example. I'm usually done hearing people before they even finish talking because I'm a fast listener. So there's a number of common reasons perhaps that people might be bad at listening. They might be attempting to multitask, and that's pretty common in our day and age, isn't it? You speak to someone and they're actually on their phone. There's a sense of judgment which a communication breaks down, assumption or preconception that you already know what someone's going to say. Perhaps you have a greater desire to talk than to hear. You might have a lack of interest in what's being spoken. Maybe you have a lack of interest about this talk, or a lack of respect for the person speaking, or maybe ego gets in the way. And there's not an exhaustive list. Perhaps you can think of reasons for yourself, that barriers that might get in the way of effectively listening. But to me, these 6 reasons, and no doubt many others, they boil down to a common denominator, and that denominator is pride. You know, they're not worthy of my full attention. I already know what they're going to say. I've heard all of that before. There's somewhere else I'd rather be, or something else I'd rather be doing with my time. On the other hand, we have reasons to listen. If we listen, we can learn. We can build trust. We can show respect. We can improve our focus. And we can gain a better appreciation. It's like setting the foundation for a relationship. If you begin by listening, you're actually quite likely to find that the other person reciprocates by listening back. And you'll find that listening comes from a place of humility, because you have to showcase by listening that the other person that's speaking perhaps has a frame of reference or a point of understanding that you don't already have. So it comes from a place of humility, and you can perhaps apply that in lots of different settings, from a formal setting, perhaps sitting in an auditorium listening to a talk or a testimony or the gifts, to perhaps even just down to the most informal conversation you have with a friend or a colleague or a co-worker. When you start from listening and you demonstrate humility, it's the same thing that Jesus Christ showed, and it sets the platform for relationship. And rather than always rushing to speak, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Thank you.